You and I are the whole point. The pearl at the center of John's prologue reveals an astounding reality that the divine life, the divine DNA, is meant to be shared with you and I. This is part one of unpacking that. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. The prior 7 episodes have brought us ring by ring to the center of John 1:1-18. And on that journey, we've been invited into John's vision of the cosmos, which begins with his vision of the divine, but which almost seamlessly includes the natural order. Before I explain how this is in fact all about us, let me summarize as best I can everything from those prior rings. The God who is the Word towards God, the God who is leaning into God's self, whose very nature is embrace, who brings God out into the open to be seen, the God who is humble, the God in and through whom all things came to be, in whom is life itself, the God whose light shines always for all everywhere, and who is that light, the God who is in the world which came to be through God. That God became part of the world, indwelt and inhabited the world that came to be through him, and as such came to be seen, known, experienced. The glory or nature of that God is grace and mercy and love, a love that is enduring and reliable, a love that can be counted upon to last. This is the heart of the divine for John, and that heart is what he wants us to see. But John wants us more than simply to see something. He doesn't want us to just see what God is like. He wants us to be what God is like. John is inviting us to nothing less than an actual sharing in the divine nature. So now here we are at verses 12 and 13, at the centerpiece, at what I've called the pearl at the center of the jewelry of John 1. My outline subtitles this as "We Can Share the Divine Life." There's so much in these 2 verses that I am going to need 2 episodes to do them complete justice. So this episode will focus on verse 12, and then I'll tackle verse 13 in the next one. But I'll read them both here together, and then as always, I'm going to go phrase by phrase. So here we are, verse 12. And yet to as many of those who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. They're not children related by blood. They're not conceived by natural human desire. They are not conceived as a result of a husband's will. They are children begotten by God. Now for that first portion as I go phrase by phrase. And yet to as many of those who did receive him. Now let me begin with a tiny little Greek word, de. This is what is called a conjunctive particle, used to link 2 clauses, sometimes to suggest the continuation of the same thought, like similar to and also and now, etc. Or it can also be used to introduce a distinction as like a but or however or on the other hand. I've translated it here as and yet, because in prior verses, John has stated that the light, which, as we saw, is another way of speaking of the God who is the Word, who is God, who was towards God, I should say, that God was in the world and came to his own world, and that his own world didn't know him and didn't receive him. That's how verse 11 ended, on a negative note that seems sweeping and all-inclusive. No one received that light, that God who is the light. And now, however, in verse 12, John says, as many as received. that meant that there are those who did receive the light after all. Hence my translation, verse 11 ends, no one received the light, verse 12 beginning, and yet to those who did receive. But what does he mean by receiving the light? The word that is used there means to take in, to welcome. Sometimes it was used to indicate that someone was married, in the way we might say that she took George as her husband. It's the word John will use later in the gospel when he speaks of Jesus being apprehended, arrested. He was received, taken. It's a word then that assumes much more than just the mental assent to a set of ideas about the light. So there's more to receiving the light than a formula that is sometimes used in Christian circles. Have you received Jesus? That formula is typically used to refer to agreeing to a certain set of ideas about who Jesus is and what Jesus did. But for John, receiving the light here involves taking the light in, welcoming it, keeping it with us, being hospitable to it. Having said that, John does speak of believing. Receiving and believing go together for him, and the flow of his sentence is like this. A, as many as received. B, were given the ability to be God's children, something I'm going to come back to. C, that is, those who believed in his name. So clearly, receive and believe here are modifying each other, even though they're clauses that are separated by another clause in between. In other words, they're two clauses that modify each other before and after that clause about being God's children. I've explained what receive means for John, so now I want to look at what it means to believe in the name, and then come back to that phrase in between the two phrases, the phrase about becoming God's children. John says that those who receive the light are also those who believe in his name. Those who believe in, actually it's not just in, it's into his name. That little word into, rather than simply in, is subtle, but may imply a more intensive, more personally engaged element than merely receiving something with intellectual assent or believing something with intellectual assent. I'm going to have more to say specifically about the meaning of the word believe when I wrap up part 2 of the Pearl in the next episode. But for now, I'm just going to say that it involves a decision and an attitude of trust more than merely the cognitive assent to or acceptance of certain facts or truths. Receive and believe, then, are the two positive responses to the light. We've already seen the negative reactions to the light, the not knowing and not receiving. So what or who did these as many as receive and believe? The context tells us that they received the light, capital L, and in the process of receiving that light, they also believed in his name, quote unquote. The context again makes it clear that it's the name of the light that was in the world and was shining in the world and then was not received. That's the name of the God who is the Word towards God, and, as we saw in the ring prior to this, the name of the Word which became flesh. Okay, but what name is that? What's the name of the light? What's the name of the Word that was towards God? Given John's sacred heritage, one answer that scholars suggest is that John has in mind the divine name that Moses received in Exodus 3 when he asked God, "Who are you?" And God's answer was, "I am who I am," or also possible to translate that as, "I will be who I will be." If that's the name John has in mind, this sentence would end up saying something like this: as many as are those who believed in that name, Yahweh. On the other hand, some interpreters suggest that John means believing in the name of Jesus here. And verse 14 and the verses that follow that are making mention of Jesus and referring to Jesus, which is what suggests this interpretation to some. However, The evidence of the rest of John's Gospel convinces me that John has something else in mind here, neither the divine name given to Moses nor the name of Jesus. Let me make mention of something that shows up later in John's Gospel. Twice in John 17, verse 6, and then again in verse 26, according to John, Jesus says to God, "I have made known to them your name." The people Jesus refers to here as them had no need for Jesus to give them his name. They already knew what his name was. And they also didn't need him to tell them the divine name. They already knew what the divine name was. Even before meeting Jesus, they knew that. In other words, there was no need for Jesus to give them either the name of God or his own name. So what name is he saying that he gave them? Let me step back for a moment in order to explain how I see things. Names in many cultures, including among the Hebrew people, are not merely labels of convenience so that we can identify someone and say in a crowd, "Hey, Kevin." They are in many ways descriptive and inclusive of the very being of the person. Names were often given in recognition of, and sometimes changed in recognition of, the character of a person. Saying a person's name was a way of affirming and describing who they were, not just a label. It was a way of describing, in a sense, their identity, their character. So I think John is saying that to believe in his name means to embrace the character of the person to whom the pronoun refers, the he behind the his. It's another way of saying they knew and recognized him for who he is and what he's like. In other words, the name here is the divine character as John has unveiled it for us in these verses, which open his gospel. That's the name that Jesus says he gave to his followers in John 17. It's the character that the Word that became flesh revealed in and through the person of Jesus, and the divine character as revealed to all people through the light that enlightens and has always enlightened everyone. It is the very character of God we have seen in these opening verses of John. And here I'm going to repeat again what that character is in these verses, because this is the name that John speaks of. The God that John knew and received, the God into whom John believed and invites us to believe into and receive into ourselves, is a being whose character is towards and into embracing, open, and humble. This is the name that the as many as that John refers to believed in. This is in part how they received him. They come to know the divine light word God experientially. Now, let me come back to the mention John made of the as many as. We've seen as many as believed, as many as received. To them he gave the right to become children of God, and we've seen the as many as believed in his name. But who are these as many ases? Who are they? The context of verses 1 to 11 makes it clear that they received and welcomed the light which was always in the world, the light of all humanity, the light that enlightens everyone. The flow of John 1 is saying that although the light was in the world and came into the world and was not received, there are some who did receive that light, that universal light. And all of that sheds light, pun intended, on who these as many as might be. They are all of those, from the very beginning through human history, who receive the light, the universal, always shining everywhere on everyone light. John is saying there have always been people who did in fact receive and welcome, who knew, who responded to the light that's always been and is shining in the darkness. There have always been people who did not and still do not. Now, it is also true that John's gospel will describe this dynamic relative to the coming of the light in and through the specific, unique, particular person, Jesus. But that dynamic, according to John, has always been at work, that dynamic of the light coming and being received and not received. In addition to receiving the light, the as many as that John is referring to here are given something more, which brings us to the clause John set in between the clauses about receiving and believing. To those who receive and believe, he, God, gave the right to become children of God. Now, let me touch on each point in that phrase. He gave authority or the right to become children of God. He. The third person singular masculine pronoun has become a regular feature in John's writing as he moves through the rings. We noted in a prior episode that it refers all the way back to verses 1 and 2, and the God who is the Word that is towards God, and to the mention of the light through whom all things came to be. This God word light is the he of the verb gave. So let's talk about gave. This emphasizes the divine initiative. Yes, humans respond or don't. They respond by receiving or believing or not receiving. But without the divine offer of a gift, there would be nothing to respond to. The initiative taken by God is something woven through the section in really every ring. According to John's vision of reality, God creates, shines, enlightens, enters the world, comes to the world, becomes flesh, and in verse 18, it's God who brings God out to be seen and known. And more specifically in this verse, however, what is it that God is giving as a gift, as the initiator? And that brings me to the next word, the word that is sometimes translated a right or an authority. Authority is the most common translation of the term, actually. The term in Greek being used here is exousia. Some translators prefer to say God gave the right, but the term can be used with the sense of enabling someone to make something real, actual. It's like activating something. So we shouldn't assume the word here refers to conveying rights or authority in the sense of a privilege, so much as the enablement or the enactment of a reality. So it's saying that he, God, gave the enablement, the ability to actualize something. But activate what, or actualize what, or make real what? And that brings us to the next phrase in that clause, to become God's children, to enact and actualize becoming God's children. The next verse, verse 13, is going to shed light on the word become and what's meant there. John could, but I want to focus here on the phrase children of God. Now, it's something that is really, really important in the Gospel of John. Here, I'm going to focus on the word children first, and then of God. In the Greek text, John speaks of becoming tekna, not huioi, which would be sons and not daughters. John could have used huioi, sons. It's the plural form of huios, or son. And idiomatically, in his day, to say sons of God would have been gender inclusive, a way to say children of God. Now, I need to take a little detour here for a moment, because subtly that idiom, using sons to include daughters, does reveal the inherent embedded patriarchy in the cultural context behind that phrase at that time, even though at the time it was a way to try to be gender inclusive. But note that the idiom is not daughters of God. It's sons of God. And for my male listeners, just pause a moment and ask what your inner experience would be if that were the idiom that you grew up with. That all your life you heard people saying, we're all daughters of God. And then you were assured, don't worry, when we say that you're one of the daughters, It isn't used to exclude you. We're not trying to suggest that being male is anything less. Now, it might be a very subtle thing, but it's real. And in fact, it's not so subtle. And I just wanted to clue into that. And I'm going to come back to this because I think there's an important point here. John elects not to use the term sons, which is gender specific, but tekna, which is not gender specific. It is just children. Why? Now, the most common reason given among commentators is that John seems to reserve the term huios, male son, for Jesus only. The suggestion then is that John wants to highlight the uniqueness of Jesus' sonship or childship in comparison with ours. He's a son, huios, we are children, tekna. And there is truth in this. John clearly does see a unique role for the human being Jesus in the whole process of divine revelation and being children of God. It's the human being Jesus in whom we're told the Word became flesh. However, in the episode where we looked at that expression, we noted that even in that very clear statement of unique specificity about the place of Jesus, the term used was sarx, flesh, and that includes more than just a physical body of one person. As one of the main architects of later Christian theology, a man named Athanasius, stated many years later, when the Word became flesh in Jesus, God was taking humanity in the plural, in the whole, into the divine, rather than the divine entering a single human being. Now, again, there was something unique in Jesus' relationship as a son, but our place as children is going to be shown in the next verse, when we get there in the next episode, as astonishingly greater, even shockingly greater than what is commonly taught in most Christian circles. But hold that thought until the next episode. I wonder, though, if more might be behind John's word choice than the theological point we've been looking at here. The term tekna is grammatically a gender-neutral plural in Greek. The fact that John uses a grammatically gender-neutral plural to refer to us is a much more inclusive reference to us all than was common in his day or in the period of the New Testament. Now, I'm not saying here that John necessarily used a gender-inclusive term consciously for the purpose of inclusivity, though he may well have done so. And I say that he may well have done so based on other evidence in John's Gospel. Several of the key figures of faith for John are women. His mother Mary is at the wedding in Cana, is the one whose open-handed request is what led to the miracle of turning water into wine. The Samaritan woman in John 4 is the first to bring an entire village into an understanding of who Jesus was. The woman caught in adultery, who's the figure, is the one who Jesus cares about and sympathizes with in the account, and ends up de facto challenging the patriarchy of his day in that event, meaning he did. There's a different Mary than his mother, whose faith in Jesus in the face of the death of her brother Lazarus is very evident in that account. And then there's Mary of Bethany, who's the one who anointed Jesus and receives his commendation. The women who discover the empty tomb and believe are the first to see Jesus risen and to speak with him after his resurrection. As such, I think it's entirely possible, indeed more than possible, it's highly likely that John says we are children in a gender-inclusive way for more than theological reasons, although I'm not denying that those are there. He really was being inclusive. Now, if he didn't consciously intend it, then assuming that Christians are right and that some form of inspiration of these verses we're looking at, some form of divine inspiration is involved, then maybe the divine inspirer intended it and was being inclusive here. All right, it's time for me to start to move on to setting up the next episode. I've only been able to explore one of the two verses which make up this central portion of John 1 to 18, the pearl, the buried treasure of the section. In this episode, I've shown how John began with a focus on the nature of the divine character towards and into and embracing and open and humble, and we've seen that throughout human history there have always been people among the as many as who have seen and known and believed and received that God is like that. They've received and known the light that is shining on everyone. John has also ring by ring shown his audience, which now includes you and I, that we are also invited to see and know and believe and receive and become God's children. Children. God's children. Divine children. There is a lot more to say about that, and I'm going to do so next time.